All right, church, let's get right into it. Last week, we went into part 2 of our Real Love series where we talked about Jesus's call and commandment for all of his disciples. And that call, that commandment is to be salt and light of the earth. Often in my past, I looked at it like, hey, if I have the presence of God in me, wherever I go, the presence of God is there. If I have the light of God in me, wherever I go, the light of God is there. And that's true. But in the context of Matthew 5, it's not just believers having the Spirit in them and so they automatically are light. There definitely are implications to that, but specifically in Jesus' teaching, he says this, he says, let your light shine in such a way that men will see your good works and they will glorify God because of it. So our call to be salt and light in this earth, it's not just us showing up. It's actually us being around people and showing them our good works, and then they glorify God. And this is what we gain from that. In order for us to be salt and light, we will have to love people. Matter of fact, the measurement of my flavor of salt, the measurement of my light is often going to be determined by how well I love other people. So as believers, if we're passionate about God, we want to see his mission move forward, we want to advance the kingdom, we can't for 1 second think that we can leave out loving people. As a matter of fact, Jesus has some really harsh words when he says about salt. He says salt is, I'm paraphrasing, but he says salt is there for flavor. If the salt has no flavor, then what use is it? Now, the context is loving people. The context is being around people, showing them their good works. And he's saying, if you're not there and you're not doing that, what's the point? He says, if you have this light and you hide it, if you have a light when you're called to love people and you're not doing it, what's the point of the light? My charge to us is loving people is not just a good idea. It's not a better way to live our life. Loving people is a call and commandment from Jesus. But what I love about this, he doesn't just leave us with the challenge to love people better. He actually gives us some foundations on how we actually love people. And it has to really do with the origins of sin. Jesus begins to teach some of these commandments. He begins to teach, he tells us that our righteousness needs to be greater, needs to surpass the righteousness of the Pharisees. And he gives us a couple of examples of what that looks like. He says, don't murder, don't commit adultery. That's righteousness, but he says your righteousness needs to surpass the Pharisees. And then he says this, he says, so don't murder. He says, however, if you say to your brother, you fool, if you're angry with your brother, you're guilty of the same punishment as murder. He says, don't commit adultery, but if you look at a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery in your heart. And this, what we learned is, this is how Jesus measures sin. It's not what we do with our hands. It's what's going on in our heart. And he says, out of the heart is where all of this stuff comes from. So we may not murder with our hands, but we do it with our heart on the daily. We may not commit adultery with our bodies, but we do it in our heart. And Jesus uses this example, I believe, to help us to see what is the foundation of love. When Jesus uses the example of adultery, and he says, listen, you may not be doing something with your hands, but you're doing it with your heart, and that is the foundation. You may not be violating that person with your actions, but you're violating that person in the heart, and God is a God who judges the heart. And this is what we see from that when we seek to love people, it doesn't start with the outward niceties. It doesn't start with simply just being nice to people. Loving people starts with our heart and our disposition towards them. Here's the problem. We can be angry with people. We can be frustrated with people. We can judge people. We can hate people. But if we come into church, we know that we're supposed to act right. So none of that comes out. Instead, we get a smile. The problem with that is, despite how nice we seem, God still sees our heart, and he measures our heart towards that person with how we really feel. This is the cure to fakeness in church. What Jesus is saying is, address the heart first, and the outward will flow. And this is what we learn from that loving people starts before we ever lift our hand to serve, before we ever open up our mouth to speak. Loving people starts in your heart when they may not even be around you. And this is the promise of Scripture. Out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth will flow. Words will flow. Actions will flow. Often we have a hard time loving people in the moment, but if we pay attention to our heart, we had a hard time loving them outside of the moment. So my challenge to us, church, is for us to be people that begin to love people from our heart. When we have that little twinge in our heart, when we think about that person, or we get angry with them, when we have a judgment against them, when we're far removed. It's not on a Sunday, this is a Wednesday afternoon, and every time someone mentions that person, you have something going on in your heart, fix it, address it. Take it to the Lord. Take it to them if you need to, because that is what is going to help us to love people better, not just learning to put smiles on our face. So I'm hoping as a church that this is something that we take in and we begin to love people well before they're even in front of us. And so this week, we're going to hear, we have a special guest speaker. We're going to hear from my buddy, Freddie Flanagan. He was the best man at my wedding. He's known me for way over a decade. I love the guy to death. He is the guy when it comes to love. I haven't met many people who love better than him. He's got a great message where he's going to be talking about the provision of God. And I think that's for us, that is so important for where we're at. There's a lot of people who are struggling with this thing. And so my hope is that it's going to encourage us. I look forward to seeing you guys on Sunday. Love you.